Welcome, everyone. My name is Christina Zuniga, and I'm the president of the Houston Young Lawyers Association this year. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're also recording this presentation so that it can be viewed later. I'm so grateful to our committee co-chairs for the day of service for organizing today's wonderful day, and that's Anietia and Regina, who are going to be moderating today's panel. And it's just a fantastic way to end our day of service, the first one for the 2020 to 2021 bar year, which is focusing on fighting against racial inequality. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Anietia and Regina. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Christina, for that. We appreciate it. Again, I would like to thank everyone for joining us today. I know it's a Saturday, and I definitely don't want to take much out of your day. So let's just introduce our panelists. First and foremost, I would like to introduce our panel in partnership with the Thurgood Marshall School of Law, Professor Thelma Harmon. She is an associate professor of law at Thurgood Marshall. She also serves as the director of clinical education, where she manages attorneys and law students who provide representation for low-income individuals on a wide spectrum of legal needs. We also have Ms. Amrutha Jindal. She is the Chief Defender Attorney at Restoring Justice. Restoring Justice is a nonprofit organization that provides members of the Houston community with legal defense representation. Prior to joining Restorative Justice, Amrutha actually spent 8 years as a trial attorney at the Federal Defender's Office in San Diego. She is also a Houston native and is a graduate of Cornell University and Georgetown University Law Center. We also have Professor Jason Casillas. He is an associate professor at University of Houston. He specializes in Latino politics, legislative politics, and as well as state and local politics. We also have Mr. Drew Bavana. He is an associate attorney at PMR Law, focusing on its personal injury docket. He is a Navy veteran with 3 deployments in support of Operation Enduring Freedom. Drew is a community outreach advocate, concentrating on the homeless and our youth, originally founding the Know Your Rights program through HILA with the mission to educate students on their rights with regards to police interactions in an effort to reduce conflict and promote relationships with police officers. We also have Mr. Richard Fink. Mr. Fink is an associate in Baker McKenzie's tax practice group. Prior to joining Baker McKenzie, Richard served as a law clerk with the Honorable James C. Mahan at the United States District Court for the District of Nevada. He is also working with Drew as well with the Street Law Committee for HILA. And the Street Law Committee advances justice through the classroom education on the 4th and 5th Amendments to students. Lastly, we have Ms. Jahaina Henderson. She is a partnership specialist with the United States Census Bureau, regionally based in Dallas, Texas, locally based in Houston. Ms. Henderson is responsible for partnerships with African-American female organizations, community-based organizations, as well as nonprofit organizations. So we're just going to go ahead and get started. As you know, with the recent murders, unfortunately with George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery, these events really served as the impetus of facilitating this panel. So panelists, as we go throughout today, feel free to share your thoughts regarding those tragic events as we get through the questions for each of you. So first and foremost, I would like to ask Professor Harmon and Ms. Jindal the first few questions regarding access to adequate legal representation through the criminal justice system. Professor Harmon, so as you know, scholars define that there is a justice gap as the difference between the legal needs of low-income individuals and the resources available to meet those needs. How does this justice gap really show up in your work as Director of Clinical Education?
It shows up differently for the civil side versus the criminal law side. Of course, for the criminal law side, every defendant has a right to an attorney. You see a gap in that area when we talk about certain sectors that provide the legal services. For instance, the public defender's office. When you have your resources are limited, therefore your staff size may be limited, but the number of cases that each attorney may be required to handle could be a major problem in terms of the amount of time that each attorney can spend for certain clients. There was a report done a few years back, in a study rather, in reference to a public defender's office, whereby on the average, each public defender attorney had 311 cases. And it boiled down to, and a lot of them were felony cases, whereby they were only able to expend about 4 hours per client, per case rather. And we all know that a felony case, you cannot try that in 4 hours. On the civil side is a big gap. The Legal Service Corporation did a study, a report, where they indicated that for every one case they accept, they have to reject 3 cases. So about 75% of the people who apply for legal aid because they can't afford an attorney are rejected, because there's such a major gap between, justice gap between the ability to pay for an attorney and needing the services of attorney. So there is a major gap. And in Texas is even worse. We are the 47th state out of 50 with the highest inability to meet the needs of those who cannot afford attorneys. Even the Supreme Court Justice, Texas Supreme Court Justice, said that we were in dire needs of pro bono attorneys. And that basically he indicated that it's no way that the attorneys in Texas could handle those types of numbers of cases. So there's a major gap in Texas between access to justice and civil representation.
Thank you for that, Professor Harmon. My next question is for Ms. Amrutha. You're at Restoring Justice. So can you tell us just a bit more about how the justice gap works and what are your thoughts on it regarding your work?
Sure. So I agree with everything that Professor Harmon said with respect to the justice gap in the criminal justice system. Where I see it as a criminal defense attorney is exactly what Professor Harmon identified, which is the appointment of counsel that are given to indigent individuals who are charged with crimes. And so I think everyone knows that universally you have a right to a lawyer, but that's not good enough, right? What really matters is what kind of representation is that lawyer giving you? And I only moved to Houston recently, and I was shocked to learn that Harris County does not have a managed assigned counsel program in their felony system. What that basically means is that attorneys who take on court-appointed cases are not required to follow certain guidelines as it relates to caseload intake. And that's really what gets into what Professor Harmon was talking about, where you have attorneys who are taking hundreds and hundreds of cases that empirical data shows it's just not effective. And a report was released 3 years ago in 2017, I believe, through the Texas Indigent Defense Commission that identified kind of the limit of what an attorney should take on as it relates to felony cases. And what we see is that a majority of appointed attorneys exceed that caseload limit. And so what happens if they exceed the caseload limit? You end up not meeting with your clients. You don't have as much time to prepare. You end up not being able to provide the kinds of services that our community should be getting from the system. So that is really what causes the justice gap, is that you have a majority of people who are in custody. I want to say over 70% of people charged with crimes in Harris County are indigent. So over 70% of people have the right to appointed counsel. that the quality of representation they're getting from that council is not to the standard it should be. And so how do we fix the gap? Well, one identifiable way is to just put more resources into the public defender and court-appointed system, and to put more policies in place to prevent court-appointed attorneys from being able to take on, however many cases they want to take on, to put in more requirements for what kinds of experience they have to have in order to get onto the panel, that kind of thing.
Thank you for that. I appreciate it. I'll go back to Professor Harmon for another question. Professor Harmon, can you tell us what is holistic representation, and what does the legal representation in this format, why does it better suit indigent defendants, I would say? What are your thoughts on that?
The holistic approach of legal representation is very critical, because the client comes to you with a set of issues, not just one legal certain issue. Sorry about that, guys. So you have to assist your client in all matters that you can or able to assist them in. For instance, I handle the family law cases for our clinic. And when someone comes to me in reference to, let's say, a divorce, and they have been separated for a few years, and I'll just use this as an example, the husband has not paid any child support, and the mother has been laid off of a job, then we have income issues, right? We need to assist them in any way that we can in terms of food stamps, some type of other monetary ways to get money in terms of child support, temporary child support, all of that. So we have to treat the whole client, because if you don't treat the whole client, then what you do for them legally is not going to make a big difference if they are homeless or if they can't feed their particular family. And what we partnered with was a health clinic, because they found that when their patients had legal issues, then they did not recuperate as fast as if that problem festered, that legal issue festered. So we partnered with a medical clinic whereby if they had any legal issues that we could take on, we would do that for them. And they did a study, and it did show that when you treated the person holistically, that person was able to thrive and grow and to develop much quicker in terms of the legal issues that they faced and the other issues that they faced.
Very interesting. Thank you. One last question for Amrutha. So I know you're working at Restoring Justice. How has COVID-19, really, did it exacerbate any of the challenges for indigent individuals or people that you guys are supporting in the community?
Absolutely. It's just made everything that much worse. Just to give you a sense of what it's like in jail at the Harris County Jail. The Harris County Jail, I think right now the population is over 8,000 people. That's a lot. It is a COVID-19 hotspot. I want to say over 1,000 cases have been affiliated or associated with the jail since the pandemic began in March. Over 75%, I think when I last looked, of people in Harris County Jail are pre-trial detainees, meaning that they have not pled guilty, they have not been found guilty, they have not been convicted. They are literally sitting in jail waiting for their day in court. Now, the pandemic is resulting in all court dates getting pushed indefinitely because we haven't had trials happening as they should for obvious reasons. Things are getting pushed back months and months and months. And so the folks who are stuck in jail because they couldn't afford their bail are literally stuck. And then you have to think about what circumstances are they stuck in? Well, they can't do anything that the CDC recommends when it comes to safety. There's no such thing as physical social distancing. The 6 feet thing is impossible to achieve when you're in a pod of 20 people sleeping in bunk beds that are 2 to 3 feet apart. You don't have the ability you don't have access or unlimited access to PPE. You don't have the ability to wash your hands every second of every day. You don't get hand sanitizer. You get a small bottle of soap every few days. So you can imagine why it is such a dangerous place to be. And when we talk about the justice gap and we see the impact of it we see the impact of it playing out right now during the pandemic, because what we see is all of the clients who are too poor to basically post their cash bond are stuck in jail in a situation where their life is at risk. And so it really makes you think, what are we doing here when we have thousands of people who have not even been convicted yet, basically risking a death sentence because they are too poor to post their bail. And that's really why this pandemic has just devastated the criminal defense communities. The people who have family members in jail are just so stressed. The people in jail themselves are incredibly stressed. It's just putting a lot of pressure on the system, and we don't see there's no real sign of change. We at Restoring Justice have been trying to bail people out. We partnered with the Bail Project to help people post their bonds. So we can't really wait for some big change to the system. So we're trying to, on a one-on-one basis, try to help people in the best way that we can by posting their bail. But of course, that's not close to what is needed, because it's only going to reduce the population by a small amount, but we're trying to help that way.
Absolutely. Wow. Well, I hope it all gets better. So next, we're just going to go ahead and move to examine the criminal justice system in its relation to education and activism. As co-chairs of Highlight Street Law Program, Drew and Richard, primarily, the two of you interact with Gen Z students. Drew, can you just give us a bit more information about the Know Your Rights program? How did it start? What's the procedure? How does it work?
Sure. There's a great national program already in place called Street Law that's utilized in a lot of universities, law schools around the country, where young students can go out into schools in their community, whether it's middle schools or high schools, and talk about their rights and the Fourth Amendment and the Fifth Amendment and arrests and stops, things of this nature. So when I moved to Houston 6 years ago, I thought it would be a great thing to try to start here, to go out to communities, especially at-risk communities in the greater Houston area, where students are generally interacting with police more than, let's say, other affluent neighborhoods, and teach them about their rights, teach them about the rights that they have in regards to the Constitution and when being stopped by the police, but also importantly, teach them the rights that the police have and what they can do, so that they're educated in the stop as a complete whole, to try to minimize the conflict and the tension, and to try to get rid of the idea that the police are always trying to do something bad, right? And try to arm them with knowledge to help them in these future situations when they interact with police, or when a family member or a friend interacts with police. So that program's been going on now for about 4 years. The schools continue to grow. We continue to try to focus on charter schools, but to grow that reach as well outside of just the immediate Houston area into outlying Houston communities. And it continually gets bigger each year. We're trying to touch as many students with this program as possible to arm them with this knowledge.
Thank you, Drew. We appreciate it. The next question is directed at Richard. Richard, what has been your experience like interacting with these students and really educating them about the criminal justice system, their civic rights, the criminal procedures and everything? Can you just tell us a little bit more about that, please?
Yeah, so I got very involved in street law in law school, which was my first real opportunity to explain my understanding of the justice system and the important rights that you are afforded under the Constitution to younger children. And at Vanderbilt, we primarily worked with a couple of middle schools and a couple of at-risk communities, and really, really appreciated how engaged these children were. I don't know if it's just a bad memory that I have of my understanding of all this when I was younger, but I was really impressed with their knowledge and their general interest in these topics. I mean, I'm not sure if this is because of the advent of social media and the ability of these folks to really connect and to not only express their opinions, but also to get real-time feedback from a lot of the people that they look up to. A lot of political figures and athletes and movie stars, artists are much more accessible than they were before. And so I think that the ability of these kids to interact with those people on a much more real-time basis, I think has really caused these kids to take a much more active and interested engagement in these topics. And I was really very impressed and excited at the opportunity to work with these kids and to teach them about what their rights are under the Constitution during street law. And when I heard about this program that Drew had started moving to Houston relatively recently, I was very, very excited to get involved.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, I mean, it sounds like you guys are doing something great for these students. So thank you for that and your service. So the next question that I have is kind of more generally to any of the panelists. Generation Z is often referred to as the social media generation. Any of the panelists can answer this question. In your opinion, does social media drive or kind of diminish civic engagement?
I'd love to start. I think it drives civic engagement because it brings awareness to issues that are going on in their community and around the country. So there's a lot of positive from that, right? It allows them to get more engaged than maybe they would have been beforehand. But the negative is that it teaches them things that maybe aren't correct. And we could term it fake news, or we could say anything we'd like, but they learn areas of the law in their own way through these social interactions, through social media, which might not be correct. So they possibly learn something about their rights that aren't correct, or they learn something about the prison system or the criminal justice system that is not correct. So that's why, I think it's very important to have some type of educational arm in communities to go out to make sure that students and young adults are getting factual, correct information about the law that they can use when they're deep in social media and engaged in their community and these different movements that are happening. So those two things can marry together.
And I'll just piggyback off of that and say, I'm on Team Drive. I think it's great. I think it has really made a big difference. We've seen in the last 8 weeks since the murder of George Floyd how many people around the city, around the country, really around the world have become engaged in Black Lives Matter, in social justice reform movements, and all of that. I will kind of remind those who engage in social media that first, of course, check your sources and make sure you're looking at trusted sources. Go out there, get educated. But then the second step is to share the education you receive. And if you're going to share it via social media, great, but also consider sharing it with your family, sharing it with people in your community who are voters, people who may not be on Instagram or Twitter. And then I would make a call to action that you not just let the sharing or posting on social media be your part in the movement. Whether it's that you volunteer, whether it's that you donate, whether it's that you vote, whether it's that you pick a particular issue that you care about in the area of racial justice or criminal justice reform, do something more than just sharing and posting on social media. So that's my little pitch on that.
I would agree with both of the previous speakers. I think it's very, very important that the word get out, and we all know that social media platforms are it. But I too have concerns about the misinformation, the information that is somewhat negative in terms of motivating individuals to do and exercise their constitutional rights. But the social media platform is just awesome. I did not realize how much power and clout and how much messaging could go out under just one platform. So I think it's very, very good. But as with anything else, you just have to be careful in terms of what you're reading and absolutely what source you're reading it from. Who is the sender? What is the source? And I think that's very important to talk to. Not only, I know I talk to my students, even in law school, about being careful and how powerful that medium is, and that you need to be careful in terms of using that platform too.
Thank you, panelists. So at this time, I'd like to touch on how the census and the legislative politics shapes the communities of color, and especially their access to economic resources and political power. So we know that every 10 years, the United States redraws their legislative and congressional districts in order to comply with the constitutional mandate that districts need to be equally populated. So the states redraws these districts using data from the census. So as we know, this year's census has been extended to October 31st, 2020, unfortunately due to the coronavirus pandemic. So Ms. Henderson, can you discuss the mammoth task of conducting the census?
Sure. Just as you mentioned before, our deadline has been extended because of COVID-19, but our mission is still the same. With that being said, we're basically meeting our communities where they are. The census counts every person living in the U.S. only once, and in the right place. And it is about fair representation. The U.S. Constitution mandates that everyone in the country be counted every 10 years, the first being conducted in 1790. So responses to the census inform how $675 billion is distributed to communities nationwide each year. Also, your responses to the 2020 census reflect how much funding the community receives over the next 10 years for schools and daycares, and funding for hospitals and clinics and places that need them the most. Speaking of schools, although many college students were displaced due to COVID-19, each on-campus college student will be counted at the university they resided in. The off-campus students should be still counted at the address they lived at prior to COVID-19, even if they came home for COVID-19. The Census Bureau produces timely local data that is critical to emergency planning, preparedness, and recovery efforts for all types of emergency in times such as COVID-19. My initiatives of meeting the community where they are food, faith, and self-care. So I rely on my partnerships, on the partnerships that I've created to help continue our population count. So right now I am partnering with the Houston Urban League and members of Omega Psi Phi, Kappa Alpha Psi, Phi Beta Sigma, and Iota Phi Theta fraternities for our Black Men Count 2020 Census Series, where I reached out to 4 of the most popular businesses or restaurants in Houston, which have agreed to assist customers with their questionnaire while they're waiting to pick up their food or even waiting in their car. And please keep in mind, social distancing is our top priority. Another partnership I have is with the Citywide Beauticians and Barbers Association and Picture Perfect Barbershop for a 2020 Census Logo Challenge on August the 12th. Lastly, I partner with churches, and we actually go out to food distributions and we conduct self-response there. Right now, we're also doing census caravans in low to no responding communities such as Fifth Ward, Gulfton, Greenspoint, and also 3rd Ward, And then we participate in a lot of back to school events. Our mission right now is strictly self-response. And we're constantly letting our communities know that you can complete your census online, by phone, by mail, and most importantly, you can text 2020 census to 313131. And so, like I said, the mission is self-response, and we are encouraging our partners in our communities to let us know what kind of events they're having so that we can join in and get, Houston counted. So we're trying to go from the 4th to the 3rd largest city in the nation.
Thank you. Can you tell us just a little bit more about how do you anticipate with COVID-19, pandemic happening, how is that adversely impacting people filling out the census and things like that?
Well, for the most part, the United States government is locally, we're formulating the same pattern as the city and the state. So whatever's going on, if the city shuts down, we shut down as well, basically. So we're just following guidelines with the city.
Thank you, Ms. Henderson. I appreciate that. So right now, we're just going to go ahead and move to Professor Casillas. I'd like to ask you a few questions about census data, redistricting, and how racial representation are all linked up together. Can you just explain what is a majority-minority approach?
Sure. So the decennial census is essential. I mean, every 10 years, as Ms. Henderson just explained, we have the census, and the census determines what we call apportionment. So every 10 years, population shifts. And in our Congress, we have 435 members. That's set by Congress. So we have that total. And when population changes, some states will lose population, therefore they'll lose representation in Congress. Other states will gain population, so they'll gain representation. So it's essential to fill out your census forms because it really affects our representation in Congress. Here in Texas, we're poised to gain a few seats, 2 or 3, in this coming census. Other states like Pennsylvania, Ohio will probably lose 1 each. So it's essential. This apportionment process determines how many seats each state gets. Then we have the redistricting process, which in Texas, it's the state legislature that draws the district lines. So here what we have is politicians picking their voters, in a sense, through the redistricting process. Other states like California have an independent redistricting commission, which takes that process out of politicians' hands. So that's something that's a movement happening in a lot of states. But we're stuck in Texas with having our state legislature draw the districts. And so that's why the upcoming elections are so important as well, because who you vote for in your state legislature race will determine how the districts are drawn. Redistricting is a very political process. It's probably the most blatantly political process. Each party is going to draw the districts in order to basically maximize their party's influence and minimize the other party's influence. And so there's no secret that each party is trying to do this. But the issue comes in when we're talking about racial redistricting, right? When we talk about racial redistricting, how do we treat people of color, African Americans, Latinos, and Asian Americans? And one of the interesting things about this is there's been a lot of, your lawyers here, a lot of case law dealing with interpretation of the Voting Rights Act. So we just saw the funeral of John Lewis the other day, who was instrumental, obviously, in pushing for the Voting Rights Act in 1965, which is probably one of the most important pieces of legislation we've had in our country. And in that piece of legislation, in Section 2, there's a nationwide prohibition on the denial or abridgment of the right to vote according to race or ethnicity. And Section 5, which is no longer in effect, but was in effect up until 2013, when the Shelby versus Holder case, the Supreme Court struck down Section 5. Section 5 is preclearance, which meant that states like Texas had to have any of the district lines that were drawn approved by the Department of Justice. Well, 2021 will be the first year we don't have preclearance, okay, in Texas, or in any other state for that matter, since the VRA was passed in 1965. And that's why it's so much more important for everyday citizens to get involved in the redistricting process, to monitor it, and to also contact your legislators, let them know how you feel about redistricting. I can go on forever on this, but let me just back up a little bit and talk about representation, because that's how we live in this representative democracy. We vote for members of Congress to represent us. And when we talk about representation, we can think of it in terms of a descriptive sense. So having people who look like you, maybe if you're African American, having someone who's Black represent you, or if you're Latino, the same way. And then there's the idea of substantive representation, which is, having your interests represented. And these concepts interact, they're not exclusive. And so obviously all this is intertwined, right? You have the census, you have apportionment, and then you have redistricting. And then it's our responsibility as voters, to vote and make our voices heard.
Thank you. So
Regina,
a follow-up question to that.
Regina, can I ask a quick question? I'm sorry, I don't want to throw you off, but I just had thought of this based off what Professor Casillas and Ms. Henderson saying. about sort of the link between racial identity and the census and how we sort of get apportioned. When I was trying to just have a better understanding of specifically like this part of the panel, there seems to be a history of distrust between communities of color, Black and brown folks, and the census, because redistricting has become such a politicized thing. So is that anything, like, do you come across that, Ms. Henderson, when you do your outreach initiatives, people just saying, this isn't something that I need to bother with because I'm not going to be thought about anyway? And then also, Professor Casillas, the same with you, just as far as in your research and what you teach, if sort of talking about that historical distrust or mistrust with that whole process.
One of the ways with our team in Houston, we have about 34 partnership specialists, and we all look like the people who we reach out to. For instance, we have, a Haitian partnership specialist, we have a Vietnamese, Chinese, and those partnership specialists deal specifically with their those communities to kind of, minimize the distrust. It is there and it is real, but looking like people that, talking and looking like people that are encouraging the census, it helps out in a sense for us.
Yeah, I would just add to that, there shouldn't be mistrust with the census, because the census doesn't draw the lines. It's really the legislators that there should be. And we know that there's always mistrust of congressmen and also state legislators. And a lot of that is earned, I think. So I think the important thing, obviously, is this whole idea of trust is also important when we think about representation, right? Because there is a distrust as well in many communities of color of politicians in general, because they feel that they haven't been properly represented. And when we look at some research about this, people of color are even more likely to contact representatives of their own race, even if they don't live in their districts.
That's true.
Which kind of says a lot about how trust and representation really interact. Because in order to have good or proper representation, you really have to have trust between the constituent and the representative.
And the entire distrust just comes from the federal government as a whole. Like you said, it's all political. It's just the distrust of the government.
Thank you, Ms. Henderson. Professor Casillas, specifically in Harris County, Houston, what majority minority districts do we have?
Right, and I'll focus on the congressional districts because there's also a lot of state legislative districts, but we'd be here way past 4 if I went through all of them. So there are 5 actually congressional districts in the Houston area that are majority minority. Of course, not all are represented by minority representatives. But one of the things that's important is that minorities may choose candidates who are not minority to represent them. That can be their candidates of choice. The 7th district, which is currently represented by Congresswoman Lizzie Fletcher, is actually a majority minority district, even though it's one of the wealthiest districts in the area. And it just really represents Houston as a whole, which is one of the most diverse cities, right, in the country. But Lizzie Fletcher's district is 45% non-Hispanic white, 32% Hispanic, and 10% Asian Pacific Islander. So if you combined all the different minority populations together, it would be considered a majority minority district, right? Of course, 18th district, one of the longest serving minority districts in the country, the third ward, so Sheila Jackson Lee's district. That district is 42% Hispanic, 36% Black. So it's a combined, we'll call it a majority minority district. Of course, same district that Barbara Jordan represented back when she was a congresswoman. Another really important Hispanic majority district is the 29th district, currently represented by Sylvia Garcia, who used to be a state senator. That district was created in 1990 as a majority Hispanic district, although it was represented by Gene Green, who retired a couple of years ago, who's white. And then, of course, Ms. Garcia ran and was elected. So that district is 3/4 Hispanic. 9th district, represented by Congressman Al Green, is 39% Hispanic, 37% Black. And then finally, an interesting district, and I left this one till the end because it's a competitive open seat. This election is the Sugar Land-based district, the 22nd, currently represented by Republican Pete Olson. Congressman Olson retired. So that district is 42% non-Hispanic white, 25% Hispanic, but then 19% Asian Pacific Islander. So Sugar Land, of course, has a large Indian American population. So I think a large portion there are Indian American. And so that's a competitive race between the sheriff of Fort Bend, Troy Nehls, the Republican, and an Indian American running, Kulkarni is his name, as a Democrat, who ran and almost beat Olson last time. So that's one of those districts, the 22nd, that's a lot of people are watching this election cycle because it could be another flip in the suburbs, which, to put my political scientist hat on, right, we're seeing a lot of shifting in the suburbs in terms of shifting from Republican to Democrat. And this district in 22nd is a perfect example of that.
Thank you, Professor Casillas. So at this time, we just got a few questions from our audience to the panelists. So this question is for Ms. Henderson. Why does the census ask for a person's race, and do the limited racial categories from which a person can choose cause any negative implications?
Can you repeat that one more time for me?
Yeah, sure. It said, why does the census ask for a person's race, and do the limited racial categories from which a person can choose from have any negative impact?
No, it doesn't. And say, for instance, you know, me speaking specifically to the Black community, if you are, let's say, for instance, Dominican Republic, you know, we ask that you know, check Black, and there's a space on the census form where you can, you know, add to the second layer of your heritage. And that is also a data preparation for the 2030 census, you know, because it's also, you are African American, but we do recognize, you know, your extra heritage, and we note that in the census form. So.
And, you know, I can just add there, the census has long sort of been controversial about how they ask about race.
Yes.
There's a good book by a sociologist named Mary Waters called Ethnic Options. And she talks about sort of these, you know, how we identify the kind of words that are used have often been imposed by the government. Certainly the term Hispanic, right, was something that was created in 1970 by the Census Bureau. And then, you know, that term has been controversial. There have been other terms as well, like Spanish speaking. And so more recently, there was a debate about Middle Eastern, the MENA category, Middle Eastern, North African. Ms. Henderson probably knows more about it, but can talk about it. And sort of how Middle Easterners would identify, right? Because technically, you know, white is not the exact term. And so, you know, there was also suspicion about how that data would be used, right? Especially after 9/11. So there's a lot of this sort of long controversy, right, about how people identify, how they self-identify. And, you know, when we talk about Hispanics as well, Hispanics have a really large intermarriage rate. And so people of mixed race, right? We have more and more people of mixed race. How do they identify? And how does that affect sort of the census and, you know, representation more broadly? So it's an important question. I think one that, you know, there's really no right answer because people identify the way they feel, right? So, you know, you could, and especially now with the 23andMe and all the DNA tests, right? You can really find out a lot more about, you know, your own ancestry.
And if you think about it now, the census, this 2020 census comes in 59 different languages. I can only imagine the increase in 2030 because we derived that information from 2010.
Thanks, everyone. We have, let's see, another question to, let's see, Ms. Jindal and Professor Harmon. And this can really be open to anyone, but it was directed to the two of you. How do you define allyship, and what are ways that people can practice it or demonstrate it?
Repeat the question for me.
Sure. How do you define allyship, and what are ways that people can practice it? That's a a big one. But then really could open to anyone. That's sort of a sort of hot topic word that's been floating around. I mean, it's been around forever in terms of like within the sort of sociological circles, but in light of recent events, there's been a lot of sort of literature around about like what being an ally is. And I think this particular person might just be curious to know what anyone's thoughts on are, what does allyship look like, and maybe, you know, how do we share our thoughts to folks about what we think allyship should look like, particularly for those of us in marginalized communities.
To me, allyship is a new word for partnering. You're partnering with like-minded individuals whose goals are your goals, whose aspirations are your aspirations, whose ideals are your ideals. So you want to ally with those types of individuals, those types of organizations that can achieve whatever agenda you believe will better your community, better democracy, better the earth, and better each individual's life. That's how I view allyship. And we do it all the time. We ally ourselves with friends, we ally ourselves with co-workers, anyone that can further our goals and our purposes in life.
And what I would add to that in terms of thinking of being an ally is thinking of yourself as an activist. I think that we need to make sure that allyship, using that word, actually means that you're doing more than just like self-identifying, but that you're actually doing. And in terms of ways to practice it, I really think that there are just so many ways. There's no one way to be an ally, but I would encourage everyone to think about how they can best be an ally in their own lives, whether it's looking at the office that you work in and what systems and policies and culture is in place. Is it a system, or are the policies, or is the culture one where everyone is being treated fairly, with respect? Is there equity? Is there inclusion? And if there isn't, like, what can you do to change it? Are you in a position of employment, like in an employer position, like high up enough to where you can actually change the policy? Or are you in a position where you need to be an ally and use your voice to demand a change in the policy? Who is your business serving? If you're a lawyer, like, who is your client population, and why does your client population look like they do? And are you actually, do you have skills that would actually benefit other individuals within our community that you are not actually serving? And how can you start serving them? So I think you can think about it in your own life and really embody being an ally by actually taking those actions as an activist to advocate for change. And I think the more that we do that, even on a small level, whether it's correcting someone's like word choice, whether it's correcting misinformation that you see on social media, like all of those kinds of baby steps will ultimately lead to bigger change. And that's really the goal of allyship, is to actually use your voice to help affect change.
Thank you both for that. What y'all both said, it kind of segues perfectly into the next audience question we got, because you referred to, Professor had referred to, just what being an ally is, which is partnering. And then Ms. Jindal brought up one of the examples is the workspace. And one of the questions we got was to Drew and Richard, which was asking, to your knowledge, what has the dialogue been in law firms, or maybe the legal community in general in Houston? What has the dialogue been in law firms, including your own, in their approach to creating institutional reform regarding culture and diversity?
So I've really seen it in two ways. This is speak generally, looking at our firm, where I'm at, and the legal community. I think people are trying to number one, partner with various aspects of their community, whether it's partnering with law schools or with elementary schools, middle schools, administrators, nonprofits, especially with HYLA and what HYLA has done to reach out to various groups in the greater Houston community that are achieving so many different types of change. But there's also been a desire to try to partner with or help support various outreach groups, political activism groups across the state to try to push through policy at the legislative level that will help to protect the rights that we're talking about, or that will help to reverse policies such as voting policies that are detrimental to certain communities in this area. So I've seen it two ways, and across the board, I've generally seen that there's a willingness of lots of different attorneys, men, women, diverse backgrounds, to get involved, whether it's legislatively or whether it's in the community. There's a big desire right now for people to go out and to help others and to enact change, especially when you look around, you see so many things that could benefit from change, that could benefit from reform.
Yeah, definitely agree with that. And just to kind of add on to, what I've seen personally from my practice, only been in for a couple years, but I mean, the law practice historically has been, very suffering from a lack of diversity. I don't think anybody's going to disagree with that. And one thing that I've really appreciated about, and one of the reasons why I chose to go to Baker McKenzie, is because I think that they are trying to do a lot of things to, correct that both inside and outside of the community. We have a diversity and inclusion community, or a diversity and inclusion board that has gotten much more active recently. We've actually expanded to allow, not only for pro bono hours to be counted towards your billable hour requirements, but also for diversity and inclusion hours. So trying to get people to interact with the community in many ways that they can. We have a summer program that actually just finished that had to go online this year, which was very a unique experience, but we have candidates that are specifically reserved for diversity and inclusion initiatives that also partner with a lot of the large firms and large companies for in-house practices around the country. So you'll get an opportunity to see what it's like at a law firm, and also see what it's like at some of these large companies like HP and Google. And I know that they have taken tremendous strides to also try and improve their legal environments to ensure that diversity is being adequately considered. And they're also asking a lot of their outside counsel when they're looking for requests for proposal, what are you guys doing to try and make sure that your practice is diverse, and how are you going to represent us? And I've really appreciated that, and how the firm that I'm at, and also a lot of other firms around the country, seem to be really kind of taking a large step forward from where we've been in the past.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Drew and Richard, for that. This question is actually for Amrutha. It looks like someone actually looked up Restoring Justice's website. They're saying that the website states that the majority of Harris County Jail inmates are pretrial detainees. Do you find that certain races are less likely to post bail? And what are some of the factors that prevent pretrial detainees from posting bail?
Yes, a majority of people who are in Harris County Jail are pretrial detainees. Yes, definitely Black and brown people are disproportionately impacted by the cash bail system. That I could go on and far past the 6 minutes we have left in the session to talk about how just discriminatory and terrible the cash bail system is. But if that is a topic that interests you, there is a lot of great information out there about the cash bail system. You can go to the Bail Project's website. They have information there about it. We need to end the cash bail system. There are jurisdictions that have done it. We need to do it here in Houston. We shouldn't be locking up people and disproportionately Black and brown people because they're too poor to post bail. And that's really what it comes down to. I mean, I've seen people in custody for months, maybe even up to a year, who are sitting in there for bonds that are less than $5,000. Just take a minute and think about that. $5,000. Now, that's a lot of money for all of us. But if we had most of us, I think, on this call would either, between ourselves, our family, our friends, be able to figure out a way to get the $5,000. And a lot of people who are in our jail cannot. And so when you think about what that really means, is that they're sitting in jail, even if it's for 2 months before they can gather the money. If they're sitting in jail for those 2 months, they've lost their jobs. Maybe they've lost their homes because they're not paying rent. Maybe they've had estranged relationships with their family because their children are upset that they weren't home or weren't taking care of them. Their lives are devastated. And so it is a huge problem, and we all need to do our part in trying to end the cash bail system, but also voting for candidates that believe in reforming or taking a different approach to bail practices. And so when we talk about criminal justice reform in the elections, remember that we are voting for judges. Judges are the ones who are setting bail. So do your research and vote for candidates who take on the practice that you believe in.
I have a quick question in reference to judges. Someone indicated to me that the Texas legislators are trying to make a system whereby the judges would be appointed as opposed to elected. Are you familiar with that, Ms. Jindal?
I've heard a little bit about it, but I'm not like super familiar with it.
Okay, because that is a major concern of mine, because we understand who that is going to impact. It's going to be the minorities. Mm-hmm. So I definitely will be looking into that, because I have grave concerns, because Thurgood Marshall School of Law has a lot of alumni who are sitting judges now. That would decimate our graduates. So this is something I think the legal community really should start looking into.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, when you look at our district judges, the bench, it actually, because they're elected, it does look a little bit like a reflection of the population. It's very diverse. That's not common to see so many judges of color on the bench. It's something that I think Harris County residents should be really proud of, that we have a really diverse bench. But Professor Harmon is right. That is the result of us having elected judges.
Yeah, I can just briefly add, you know, we do elect our judges in partisan elections, and there's been sort of a debate about that, about whether we should continue doing it that way or elect them in nonpartisan elections, kind of the same way we elect our city government, our mayor, and our city council. And of course, other states, as the professor just mentioned, do have appointed systems, like New Jersey does it this way. But in the legislature, of course, I think getting the votes to change it would probably be difficult, I imagine, for the very reasons the professor just gave. I think there would probably be more support for kind of a partisan to nonpartisan. But then that would require even more education on the part of voters to investigate, you know, who they're voting for, and looking at all the candidates and their platforms.
Well, this concludes today's panel. Thank you all for joining us today. If you have any questions, any of the audience that we did not get to today, please feel free to reach out to Agneti or I, and we will direct you to the panelists that would be able to better serve you. Again, thank you. Christina, if you have anything to say to everyone.
Thank you, Regina. Yeah, just quick overview of today's day of service for those who haven't been following along on our social media, and I encourage you to do so if you haven't. Agneti and Regina put together a 4-part day of service. So this morning and early this afternoon, some volunteers were at the Beacon working with Houston's homeless community to help provide food for them today. And we encourage you to reach out to the Beacon if you're interested in volunteering. It's a wonderful organization doing really good work, and we had a great experience with them today. We also are working with Choose to Do Inc., a nonprofit here in Houston. Some of our members are teaching virtual classes, and those will be available on YouTube. So you can go check out Choose to Do on YouTube and see the wonderful classes they're putting together. Of course, we had this amazing panel, and I thank you again to our panelists and everyone who joined. We're going to be posting this on YouTube so you can share it with your networks, and we'll of course share it with ours. And then the last thing is we have a financial component to our day of service. If you're interested in donating to the Thurgood Marshall School of Law Clinical Legal Studies Program Bail Fund, we talked a lot about bail today. The link is on our social media, and it's also in some of the newsletters we've sent out. Thank you to Professor Harmon for joining us today and for your wonderful work, and we encourage you to give as much as you're able using that link. Thank you again, everyone. We appreciate your time on a Saturday, and stay safe, stay dry, and we'll talk soon.
Bye-bye.